Hello everyone, welcome to Painting Crafty, and come on in, we're going to have a little fun with a little mixed media piece. I love doing these characters on these black backgrounds and then adding those bright touches of color. I'm going to show you how you can use some colored pencils to create his little fuzzy look and add all the little fun details on here. I have a special offer with this painting. If you are a follower on my Ko-fi page, and there'll be a link down in the description, you can pop over to my Ko-fi page and you can pick up the tracer as a special thank you for those who follow along on my channel on YouTube. Well, let's get started and I'll show you the beginning steps of how I created this little whimsical reindeer and his winter friends. To start off, the first step I did was to base coat my piece using some black chalk paint. And then I took my tracer and added the line work on the top. You can simply, once you print your tracer off, turn it over, go ahead and trace around your lines using some pencil, make it a little nice and dark, and then you can flip it back over and then use a pencil and trace over those lines again, and that should transfer the image quite easily. I've already started with the base coat blocking. I'm using just the big shapes of the areas. I didn't put in a whole lot of detail at this point. I'm using a scruffy brush at this time. I love using these little children's brushes from Walmart. They just can kind of give a nice little scrubby texture to it. The bristles aren't too soft, but they're not too hard either. But I like doing kind of a wet, dry technique where I'm coming in, loading my brush, but then kind of rubbing it off a little bit, and then scrubbing that paint in and layering the colors. I don't need a precision brush. I'm just adding a little blocks of the color in. So I layer in one. It's going to be slightly different color because of that black underneath there. And then I just continue to layer kind of the same colors right on top. You can add a little bit of white into your colors or green, whatever you would like to do to change them up. Here you can see me scrubbing that color into the nose, and I can double load my brush too. So I'm taking a little bit of the base color that I used originally, then adding a little bit more rusty color to one end of my brush, rubbing it back and forth on my palette, and then I'm coming in and leaving the dark end of the shadow line on the outside wherever I want it, and then just scrubbing my colors in. It's a great way to add a shadow to some of these areas. Those antlers, I decided they were a little too bright. It's not white paint, but it's buttermilk. It's called buttermilk. But I wanted to add a little bit more color to them, so I took some raw umber color and went over those quite quickly. That's going to give me more room to add a little bit more color. It was too bright, and I needed to add a little bit more color to that area. For his hat, I just used the same colors that I had used on his scarf, building them up basically the same way, using that scruffy little brush and scrubbing in the colors as I go. To add a little bit more shadow to those back legs, I need to choose a slightly darker color. I'm going to go with a raw umber color, and I'm going to rub that on those back legs. That's just going to add that extra shadow to kind of indicate that there's a front leg and there's a back leg. To add a highlight to the reindeer, I'm going to be using the base coat color first on my brush, tipping the corner in the cocoa color, and then running a highlight on the front part of his legs and underneath his tummy a little bit, on the back side of his tail, and on his little bottom. That's just going to bring a nice little highlight to him. Once I had the highlights done in those areas, I wanted to run a shadow along the blanket and underneath his scarf. I'm going to use that same color that I used on his legs to go ahead and add a little bit of dark shadow around the blanket in those areas. I'm going to keep on working on that yellow area, just layering up my colors. I've been working on that trim area too. I've been layering my greens. Basically, I started with that lighter shade of green, then added in the original color without any white in it, and added another layer of green, and now this is my brightest layer. I'm using a really pop-up color called Citron Green, and that's just going to bring that vibrance to that area. To add a little bit more color to his hooves, I'm going to be using the color Raw Umber. It's a slightly different shade than black, and I'll be adding a highlight on top of those as well. Taking a little bit of that cocoa, making and brushing a little bit of highlight on them, darkening up some of the back ones, so it's that dance between adding a little dark and then putting on a little light. I decided his brown on his body could even use a little bit more bounce of a brighter color. So I chose to use the color burnt sienna and brushed a little bit of that on as well. That's just going to add that next layer of red tone to his fur. Now's when I'm finally going to make those pink birds red. I like to put that light color on first because that dark black color is underneath there. If I layer those reds on top, it's just going to be very flat and matte looking. So if I add a little bit of that whiter color first, then my reds are going to pop more. I do have a secret ingredient though. It's called Golden Fluids Pyrrole Red. That's my favorite red color, and I'm going to be adding that to these little birds and right at the beginning to really make them pop red. I finally got the yellow built up, a good quality of yellow underneath, and now I need to add a little bit of a floated color shade of the burnt sienna color around the edges just to give it a little bit of a glow. Keep on working on those shadows. It can always go back in. That's the great thing about acrylic paint. If you don't like it, you can either add more, let it dry first, and then add more, or paint over it. So it's never a done deal with acrylic paint. You can start over and add more layers if you need to. And I often do. Now that I had pretty much all the base coating done and completed where I wanted it, I'm going to go ahead and add the eyes. I'm just freehanding the eyes on now in the nostrils and the mouth, but you can use your tracer too. You could put the tracer over the top, go over your lines, and then you can trace them on where you want them. For the eyes and the nostril details, I was going to be using the color Burnt Umber. I like that idea of having kind of that dark chocolatey look for the eyes. I was using a really bad brush at this step and my lines weren't turning out well. Eyes are kind of important, so you need to take a little bit of time and make sure they have kind of a look that they look well together. I do end up having to repaint it and reshape them, but I get it to work out, and that's a really good thing about acrylic paint, like I've been saying, is you do have a second chance and you can repaint those areas and fix them and make them look better. I finally found a good little round brush with a nice little tip on it, and I fixed his eyes, and then now I'm adding some trunks in for my trees. I'm just hand brushing these in. Once I had those hand brushed in, I just picked up a variety of greens and then just kind of did little ziggy-zaggy lines back and forth to create the greenery on the trees. Real simple, nothing too fancy or fussy on this step. Again, start with a little darker color, mix a little white with your greens, and then pop it in. And the very final color that I used on the top of the trees was that citron green to bring that little bit of pop to it. Now to add the color floats around his eye. I'm going to slow this part down a little bit so I can explain color floating. I dip my brush into my clean water, tap it onto my paper towel until the shine is gone. Then I just dip the corner of my paintbrush in the paint, rub it back and forth on my palette to disperse the paint from dark to light all the way across the eye. And then I can add my watercolor floats. I can add the floating on the outside of the eyes, go lightly underneath. If they get too dark underneath, he looks a little too tired. So you want to have the darkest float on usually the outside of your eyes, get a little light on the bottom, and then you can carry it up on the edges. I use that same color float technique around the outside of his face just to give him a real soft, pretty look. I'm going to use that same watercolor floating technique up on top of the antlers, and I'm going to be using that darker color, the raw umber color up there, just to add a little bit more dimension. That's going to add that curve up there so they look like they have a roundness to them by adding the color floats. I wanted to add a real strong shade of blue, and Admiral Blue and the Apple Barrel color is one of my favorites to do this with. I'm going to do that same kind of color floating technique in the center of his hat and add a little bit of it on his scarf too. And that pretty blue, that Admiral Blue on top of those other blues looks so good. Next up, it's one of my favorite parts. I'm getting out my Kimberly 9XXB pencil, and I'm going to be doing some details around his eye, and I even used it to draw his mouth. I love this little soft charcoal-y style pencil. It adds rich dark lines, and I'm going to be using it to create those little feathered eyelashes and create those dark rich tones around his face. I'm also going to be going around and adding extra bits of it here and there, and that's where I'm going to start the process of finishing off his face. To create the little white highlights in his eye, I want to first create a soft one. So I'm using my colored pencil in white and doing a soft little highlight on the left side of his eye. Then to put the bright highlights in, I'm going to be using white paint and a stylus. I'm going to dip it in the small end and then create two little dots at the very right top corner of each of the eyes. And then I'm going to be doing a dip, dot, drag technique at the bottom of the eye to create those little swishes at the bottom. All the little details make a difference in these eyes, and it really does draw the person into your painting. Take a little practice if you need to off to the side, and try that if you want to first before you do it on your painting. But then again, it's just acrylic paint, so if you mess up, you can paint them over. Now let's go ahead and add a little soft blushing to his cheek. I like using this scruffy brush that I have. It's a nylon brush, so the bristles aren't too hard. I first rub it in my darkest shade of red, which is burgundy, and I always scrub it on my palette, but then I scrub it in my hand, and when it feels dry, I know I have enough off, and then I can go ahead and do little circles and get those little cheeks to pop out. I like using two colors actually, so I do the dark color, and then I take a little bit of coral, do the same thing, and rub my lighter color on the top. Someone watching said it was probably a 1980s thing. I guess I am a 1980s girl, so that's appropriate. And then these cheeks need little dot highlights as well, so I'm using my little stylus and creating the dots on each side of the cheeks. Now I'm going to go back and work a little bit more on those birds. I really don't want to see any of that pink color, so I need to cover it up, add another coat. I'm going to be adding some of the deep burgundy, but then I'm going to be using that bright color red called pyrrole red on the top, and that's going to bring a lot of bright color to those little birds. Now it's time to add the pencil party to this. I love using colored pencils on top of this paint. All of this paint is very flat and matte, so it takes the colored pencils really well, and because it's on black, the colors just really pop. I'm basically going in and adding either contrasting colors or complementary colors, creating patterns, adding more line work, and adding interest that way. I also go back in and use my Kimberly 9XXB pencil and add little scribbly bit lines around the outside of my deer, and it just creates this really fun look. To add the little bit of softness and the wispiness to the hair, I use a light colored pencil and just kind of flip little hairs around his body, and it adds the sweetest little furry look to this guy. This is where you get to be as creative as you would like to be. There's no real formula. Just do it till it makes you feel happy and you think your piece looks really nice. Remember to use that white pencil too. It adds beautiful little soft highlights to your piece. I'm trying a new technique here that I haven't done before. I'm using a General's white chalk pencil. You dip it in water and then I traced around my letters. By dipping in the water, it's supposed to make the chalk more bright, and I think it does. In the end, I do end up going back and adding a few more like down strokes using my white colored pencil to add the details. One of the finishing details for this piece is I wanted to use some of that real estate on the outside because you have this beautiful border, and I wanted to create some vine work and leaves and some red berries to bring that pop of red like where those little birds are, to bring that around the picture. The colored pencils were great for this. Just hold it a little bit back farther loose and create those little curvy lines on your piece. I did it in blue, and then I just picked up the variety of the shades of green and blues that were already on my palette that I had used on the scarf and on the little blanket. That's the colors that I used for my leaves. I'm just creating very simple leaves with a round brush. I call them football leaves. They have a point at one end. You give it a little bit of pressure when you're in the middle to make it a little wider and then end with a point. But it's nothing fancy. It's just basically picking up the colors. I usually have more than one color on my brush and I don't wash it out. So I just continue that leaf look around. And then here comes that bright pop of red, that same pyro red that I used on the birds. I'm going to be adding some berries all the way around. And I think it did tie it all together really well, is to have that red go all the way around the picture. I'm going to be connecting the berries too with that brown pencil that I had used. I had used a brown pencil to create the legs for my birds instead of being a black so you could see it. But I'm going to use some branches to create that look too, to connect all the little berries all the way around. And here you can see me kind of loosening up my letters by using the white color pencil. I add a few little details by adding some dots to some letters, and then add some little sideways feet, they call them, I guess, at some of the bottom ones for the friends. It just kind of loosened it up and gave my lettering just a playful look. The chalk pencil is a little brighter, and then the color pencil is a little bit more subtle. The words need to be finished, so I'm going to create them in eye, and I'm going to use my stylus dipped in white paint. Once that white paint is dry, I'm going to even use a teenier, tinier stylus and put a little black one in there too. The stylus tools really are helpful for creating these super small dots. Once this step is done, I'm going to give my piece time to dry, and then I'm going to give it 2 coats of matte varnish. Well, let's take a look at what this little guy looks like sitting in my studio amongst some of the other Christmas and winter things I have created so far on my YouTube channel. And here he is, looking cute as can be. I just love his little face. Those little eyes just come to life. And all those little extra scribbly bits of the colored pencils bring the texture and the life to this painting. If you want to make this little guy, make sure you go over to my Ko-fi shop and get that free tracer. I'd love to say thank you for all of the followers who are over there. If you're new to my channel and you like doing art and crafts, come on over and see what I'm doing. I'd love to have more creative friends join me. Leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up. It can really help my channel grow. If you enjoyed this little guy, here's a couple more tutorials you might want to check out. Well, thanks for joining me today, and hopefully you'll come back and join me again. And perhaps next time you'll paint right along with me.